discuss about two key elements of the youth guarantee. And those two elements are apprenticeship and traineeships, or also sometimes called internships. I have with me today also my colleague Lisa Rustico. Maybe Lisa, you would like to say a couple of words. She will come in later, but maybe just to say hello.
Yes, with pleasure. Good morning and good afternoon from my side too. My name is Lisa Rustico, and I work at the ETF and in the team of War-Based Learning together with Stefan, and I will have the pleasure to share with you some reflections on the topic of War-Based Learning, apprenticeships and traineeships, internships in particular. So the focus is War-Based Learning programs. Because in the translation, when Eva, you were speaking, I heard that the interpreter translated War-Based Learning with learning by doing. This is not exactly the same thing. What we are focusing on today is War-Based Learning, which is a term that refers to all forms of learning that take place in a real work environment. So, for example, if you have learning by doing in a laboratory in a school, that is not work-based learning. If we have a pupil in a company discussing with his tutor or his mentor, this is work-based learning. So the purpose of work-based learning is providing individuals with the skills needed to successfully obtain and keep jobs and progress in their professional development. And apprenticeships and internships/traineeships are two of the most common types of work-based learning. So they take place in a real work environment. They usually, but not always, combine elements of learning in the workplace with learning in a classroom-based environment. But this is not always the case. As Eva mentioned, in the European Youth Guarantee, the idea is that young people below the age of 30 get a quality offer within 4 months since their graduation. This offer can be education, continuing training, employment, or guess what? Apprenticeships or internships and traineeships. So we are going to focus on these two options that are among the possible quality offers that young people can get as part of the Youth Guarantee quality offers. Why are they relevant? They are relevant because, as we all probably know, they are supposed to ease the transition into formal, stable employment and also improve people employability in a lifelong learning perspective. Why? Because they give a concrete opportunity to develop skills and competencies that are directly relevant to firms and sectors, but also very simply the chance to gain maybe the first work experience while still learning. These programs, usually, they should have a market for themselves. So they should be demand-driven, meaning that there should be a place for matching demand and supply of these programs. Now, in this slide, you see what are the differences between apprenticeships and traineeships. Let's take them one by one. So apprenticeships is one of the main types of work-based learning. They aim, no, it's still the first, please stick to the previous slide again. Apprenticeships aim at the previous one, number 2. This one, please stick to this for a few minutes still. Apprenticeships aim at developing occupational skills and lead to recognized qualification. This is the right slide. Great, thanks. They combine in different patterns school-based learning with learning at the workplace. And this component at the workplace should account for, it should be meaningful. So we say at least roughly 50% of the whole scheme duration, which should be typically a few years. It should be long. So it's a structured, formal vocational education and training programs. 3 years, 4 years, half of which in the workplace. We will go into the details later, just to give you the first information. Most often, apprentices have a contract with the company, and this contract is an employment contract. They have employees, and as such, they receive a salary, meaning a taxable income, and they have the status of an employee, so which is associated to social protection, social security, and so forth. Normally, this term, we will see it also later, is used for the whole program. So the whole program is called apprenticeships. Now, what are internships and traineeships? Very different thing. First of all, they're shorter. They're still work-based learning programs. So there are training periods happening at a real workplace, but they're very shorter. We talk about few days or few weeks, few months. And they may or may not be part of a formal program, and they might be compulsory of this formal program. So, for example, Stefan will talk about it later, a formal vet program, which includes, I don't know, a couple of weeks at the end of each year where people go to a company. The two terms, internships and traineeships, are very often used as synonyms in the countries, although they are not, and we will see it later. But the big distinction is between apprenticeships on the one hand, so the very long programs with at least half of the time in the workplace, with an employment contract, with a formal vet qualification after the end of the apprenticeships on the one hand, and internships, traineeships on the other hand. Are there any questions or doubts on this first distinction?
Коллеги, если у вас комментарии или вопросы...
Dear colleagues, maybe you have comments or questions. It is the right momentum to ask them.
I hope it's clear.
They can unmute their mic and ask. Good afternoon, good morning, dear colleagues. Good morning, dear trainers. I have a question. Apprenticeship and internship, I understood. But apprenticeship from school, with school, it is combination on job and it's a world of work. It is in the secondary education or it is vocational. We are talking about what? Because we have learning like internship and production internship, and it means apprenticeship if it is at the learning process, secondary school.
So I'm not sure I understood the questions. So first of all, apprenticeships can be part of vocational education and training. They can at upper secondary level, but they can also be part of tertiary level, of post-secondary level, but they are part of formal vocational education and training programs. In some countries, apprenticeships are also part of general education at upper secondary level, post-secondary level, or tertiary level, as I said. So the level typically is upper secondary, but apprenticeship can be also at higher level. Same thing for internships and traineeships. We will see it later in the details. Internships can be part of upper secondary, they can be part of post-secondary or tertiary, and traineeships can be part of active labor market programs, so part of continuing vocational education and training. So for adults, not linked to any formal vet program as such. Does this answer the question? Because the interpretation also mentioned industrial training. I didn't understand.
No, industrial, you saw production training. Now it is clear. It is
Okay.
clear.
Great, thanks. So maybe now we can move to the next slide and we give an example of what we typically call classic apprenticeship type 1. And we illustrate it through the example of Switzerland, which is indeed an example of a classic apprenticeship model. So the program is at upper secondary level. It lasts about 3.5 years, and it has two components. Learning at the workplace, accounting for about 75%, and learning at a vocational school, accounting for 25%. The learner has an employment contract, and he or she is an employee of the company. And Swiss companies typically advertise apprenticeship vacancies throughout the country, and interested students can apply to the companies. So this is what I meant by there is a training market where supply and demand for apprenticeship meets. So it is an action of the student to apply to a company as if he or she would apply for a job, but they apply for an apprenticeship. The prerequisite to start the apprenticeship in this Swiss model is a training contract that has to be signed between the apprentice and the company, and in some cases also the vocational school. This training contract is valid for the entire training period, meaning that apprentices are also paid, remunerated, also for the time that they spend in the vocational school, this 25% that you see on the slide. As a rule, apprentices spend the entire duration of their in-company training in one company, so they don't change. Although there is also this possibility in other countries, but let's not complicate the picture in this slide. So where is this stronger connection in this case? The connection is between the company on the one hand and the apprentice on the other hand. So it's very close, because it's like the apprentice is an employee of the companies. Although the program is linked to a formal vet program, although there is a final qualification at the end, although 25% of the time is spent in the school. If we move to the next slide.
I'm sorry. It seems we have some problem with translation.
Okay. Please stop.
Девочки, переводчики. Нету, не слышно перевода.
Just a minute that we are checking. Nina?
Калипа, вы нас слышите? Перевода не слышно было на русском.
Перевода не слышно, да, коллеги.
Сейчас слышно перевод? Калипа? Вот Сару слышно.
Okay, we can start.
Давайте.
Lisa.
Okay,
Lisa,
great.
we can start. Thank you.
We move
Lisa,
to the next slide, please. Okay. So while what I've just presented is what we call the classic apprenticeship, there is also, let's say, at least another way of doing apprenticeships, meaning that in this type 2, in this example from Montenegro that you see on this slide, the apprenticeship programs, in these apprenticeship programs, the students, the apprentices are students, they're not employees, at least at the beginning of the program and during the school phases. So it's not like in Switzerland where they're still paid when they go to school, because the tighter connection is between the student and the company. In this case, in this second type, let's say, of apprenticeship, it is the vet provider, it is the school that has a leading role in the organization and implementation of the program. And it is the school, the teachers, that mediates the relationship between the learner and the company. For example, while in the Swiss model, it was the student looking for a company, here it is the enrollment takes place first in the school. So in this second type, unlike the first type, the heart of the relationship is between the vet provider and the student. It is the vet provider that mediates the relationship between the student and the company. So the student first goes to the school, enrolls in the school, and then it is the company that helps the student finding suitable training companies. In this case, because of the nature of this type of doing apprenticeship, a contract between the company and the learner is not a prerequisite. It's a direct consequence of the fact that the student first enrolls in the school. And the contract, because there is a contract, which can also be an agreement, it doesn't have to be an employment contract, between the school and the employer, usually applies only to the part spent in the company, only to the time spent for the work-based learning when the student is at the firm with the employer. So this type of apprenticeship could be understood as a mode of vet delivery rather than a self-standing program with its own market, as we said for the Swiss apprenticeship. It's two different types of, I say, doing apprenticeship. There is no right or wrong, good or bad. It is just different, a different way. So is it distinction clear on how it works, which is the role of the companies and the vet providers? So then maybe I can provide some more terminological clarifications in the next slide, please. As I said at the beginning, the term apprenticeships is normally used for the whole program, the whole, let's say, for the 3 years. But in some cases, it is used only for the work-based learning component. It depends country by country. In many cases, in many countries, apprenticeship programs are also referred to as dual programs. So basically, it should be the same thing, apprenticeship and dual programs. Because why dual? Because learning takes place in two different learning venues, company and the school. And the training provision is distributed among these two venues. So the school-based, or called classroom-based training in the school, and the on-the-job training at work. So the offer of the job training can take place in a school or in a center, but also in an area of the company which is set aside from the production line, for example, or from the service provision area, which is set aside for imparting education and training specifically. For the, I called it on-the-job training, we sometimes also use the term practical training, which is used for the work-based learning component. Another distinction is between dual systems and dual programs. So what we have talked about until now is dual programs. It is the apprenticeships. Because in order to talk about a dual system, you need to have an overall governance in place. So the system refers to, as I said, the governance, the role employer representatives, so the unions, and on the side of the employers, it could be business associations. The system also includes the accreditation in companies, a program. So, for example, I mean, we could have a dual program in a country, but not a dual system, but not vice versa. Now, reflecting on what a dual program is, maybe I would like to invite you to reflect on the fact that we cannot call a dual program one that has only, I don't know, 10% of workplace component, of work-based learning component, because as we said, the dual program is an apprenticeship, and an apprenticeship is a program that has a substantial share of work-based learning out of the entire duration. In the type 1 that I showed you, that was 75%, or it can be 50%, but it cannot be just a few weeks or a few months of the whole entire duration.
So when we talk about traineeships and internships, we can basically make a distinction between 3 types. So there is, let's say, a traineeship or internship that is part of a vocational education and training program. You could, for example, imagine a 3-year program at upper secondary, and in the summer there is an internship. So each summer the students take an internship. Then there are internships or traineeships that are part of active labor market programs. So these are usually programs that are offered to unemployed people. And then lastly, there are also traineeships or internships that are offered on the open market. So these are traineeships, internships that are offered by companies, for example, to graduates from higher education, but also from vocational education and training, also from general upper secondary education. So basically, we can make the distinction between those 3. And then we go to the next slide, please. Now it's asking me again about the language. But there is no English. I don't know what that is. Okay.
Перевода нет.
So this illustration shows you the different entry points. Now we are talking again also about apprenticeship. So what Lisa elaborated a lot in the last 30 minutes, but also traineeship and so what you see is a little bit a simplified, let's say, illustration of an education and training system. We have at the bottom of the chart, we have lower secondary, and there we have a first threshold where usually the first problems emerge, because of course we have students that drop out from lower secondary or primary even, and therefore cannot make it into upper secondary. So there might be problems there with students. That can be dropouts, but it can also be graduates from lower secondary who have difficulties to choose the right track or to find, when it comes to apprenticeship, a company. But there are, of course, also potential problems within upper secondary. We have, again, a lot of dropouts. That is a major problem, for example, in apprenticeship programs, also in the classic apprenticeship programs like in Switzerland or Germany. We have a high dropout rate because either the learner is not happy with the company or the company is not happy with the learner. So that also happens. And then, of course, we also have dropouts in the, let's say, general stream. Basically, we can make a distinction between in the general stream between an academic stream and a vocationalized stream. So that could, for example, be a scientific gymnasium or high school, but the programs are usually not based on occupational standards. Yeah. So when it comes to occupational standards and qualifications, we talk about the vocational stream, where we have streams where learning in the school or at the center is combined with learning in a company. And then we have streams or tracks that are rather school-based. These are, let's say, in many systems, the basic options. And not always all options are there. Sometimes we only have, for example, when it comes to the vocational track, or the vocational stream, we only have a school-based track, and we still lack the work-based learning track or the apprenticeship track. And of course, also in the general stream, we do not always have a vocationalized track. So here, of course, as I said, we also see problems. We see problems with dropouts, or we see problems with graduates, for example, from vocational tracks, but they don't make it to the labor market. So they don't find employment, although they have a vocational qualification. So you already see some options. What could be offered then after the, let's say, second threshold? These are, for example, post-secondary programs. Of course, also from all streams, potentially students could also proceed to higher education and, of course, to the labor market. We wanted to illustrate those, let's say, first of all, those two thresholds, but also the different streams, because that also hopefully makes a little bit clearer where so-called use guarantee measures could come in. And we will give you 4 examples, and we will touch 4 different entry points. We will talk about one measure that is, let's say, still in lower secondary. We will talk about one measure that is to be found within upper secondary, and we will talk about 2 measures, use guarantee measures from 2 different countries again, that are coming after the second threshold, or at least to facilitate from upper secondary to the labor market. So we could move to the next slide and start with the examples. So this is an example about Germany. As you all know, we have different tracks in Germany. We have, when we talk about the vocational stream, we have a classic apprenticeship program, a so-called dual program with a large work-based learning component, about 65%. But we also have rather school-based vocational programs, and of course, we also have the general tracks. This is now an example that is about students who graduated from lower secondary, so completed lower secondary, but still have difficulties to make the right choice. So they're still a bit, let's say, insecure of occupation offers can, let's say, try different companies and have a deeper look at the vocational programs they offer, or you could also say the occupations they offer. So if a student is still not sure if he wants to become an electrician or maybe a web designer, the Public Employment Service can facilitate internships or traineeships in a couple of companies, so that the young person then, let's say, can take his or her decision on a more solid foundation. It is funded by the Public Employment Service. So, for example, they can cover the cost for transportation, or also a small allowance. That is one example, let's say, before the first threshold, to, let's say, facilitate the transition from lower secondary into upper secondary. Then the next example is, next slide, please. This is an example from Austria. So here we are already talking about upper secondary. And in Austria, they developed actually a really, really nice measure for those students that are already clear. I want to, let's say, follow a dual program. For example, I want to become an electrician, or I want to become a cook. But in the national system, they still have a difficulty to find a company because, as my colleague Lisa explained earlier, in the classic apprenticeship programs, this is let's say, a condition to find a company, because you need to conclude a contract with a company before you can start the dual program or the apprenticeship program. So if the young person has difficulties to find a company, but is already clear about what occupation or what trade he or she wants to learn, then for a transition period, they can also make the contract or conclude the contract with a vet provider, with a center. And then the aim is, the objective is that after a couple of months, or maybe after 1 year, with the help of the training provider and also of the public employment service, to find a company. But at least they can already start the program. And that is exactly important, because we talked at the very beginning, Lisa talked about this 4 months period. And that is the overarching, let's say, objective of the youth guarantee, is that we ensure that all young people can follow within this period a program, an education and training program, or they find employment on an education program within those 4 months. So this really, really helps. This is a really good measure, and works very well in Austria. Now I kindly ask Lisa to proceed with 2 more examples.
Next slide, please. So these examples are above the second threshold, if you can remember the slides, the colored slides with the pathways that Stefan showed a few minutes ago. So this example comes from Greece, and it is about a post-secondary apprenticeship programs, meaning that there is a student, we call her Eleni in this case, who has completed a 3-year school-based vocational training programs, and now at upper secondary level, and now she cannot find a job. So she registers at the Public Employment Service, and here they, I don't know, I have this question about the speaking language. Maybe it's the one you had, Stefan. Okay. And here at the Public Employment Service, they offer her a 1-year post-secondary apprenticeship programs, which focuses on work-based learning. 80% of the duration of this 1-year program is spent in a company. So this program is for all young people that are aged 18 plus. And this is also because Greek companies are most likely to accept adults, people that are not minor anymore, probably also for the health and safety restrictions that apply to minors. With this apprenticeship program, Eleni will combine learning at the workplace for most of her time with some time of learning of the job in a vocational school or in a training center of the Public Employment Service, for example, and she will develop skills and competencies that are directly relevant to the field where she graduated from in the upper secondary education, which in the example it was car mechanics. So this is an example of apprenticeships after upper secondary education as, let's say, an active labor market program. If we move to the next slide, we will see another example from Italy, where we have Francesco, 21 years old, who graduated from university. He completed 3-year bachelor degrees in cultural studies, in anthropology in this case, and he cannot find a job. So he goes to the business liaison office of his university or industrial liaison office, and they offer him a traineeship called Traineeship for Training and Career Guidance Purposes. So this traineeship is not part of the curriculum of the university program, which Francesco has already completed. It's something detached from the university curriculum. And here the regulation in Italy varies across regions, and we chose this case of Piedmont, where the minimum duration is 2 months and the maximum duration is 6 months. Francesco will be compensated, will earn, let's say, will receive a compensation, not an income, and will sign an agreement with the company. That would be it, Stefan.
Okay, maybe we can briefly go back to this illustration with the different colors, with the different streams, just to wrap this up. Before the examples.
This one.
This one. So because this is really important, we showed you now 4 examples from 4 different countries. But of course, you need to analyze where are the problems in your countries. What we see that we have a lot of problems still, let's say, under the first threshold. So we see young women that drop out from lower secondary or primary because they have obligations, family obligations. This is a target group, very, let's say, prominent in many of our partner countries. We have, of course, also weak learners who can't make it. So they might need other measures, other support measures. You need to, of course, follow this and also analyze this, also with indicators. So, for example, dropout rates and also transition rates. So, for example, if you have a system where, let's say, 98% make it from lower secondary or primary into upper secondary, then you have a minor problem. There might be no measures needed there because we're talking about a very small number. Then look at, of course, at upper secondary. Here, the key indicator, once again, are, of course, dropouts. In some countries, we see very high dropout rates in some programs. A good example, for example, is cooks, because many of them are not happy with the program, or when it is an apprenticeship program, many are not happy with the working conditions. So we see very high dropout rates there in some classic apprenticeship systems, up to 50%. So this is really, really a lot. And then, of course, the right measures need to be taken there to respond to this challenge. And then, of course, the second threshold is something that is, let's say, very obvious in many of our partner countries, that, for example, graduates from rather school-based vocational programs do not find employment because they never were really exposed to experiences in companies. So they lack the practical component of their education and their vocational education and training program. We see this problem far less with classical apprenticeship programs because they already spend a lot of time in the companies. They get to know the company and the companies get to know them. So that really helps when it comes to the transition from upper secondary into or to the labor market. So you really need to look at your country, at your system, what is lacking. As I said, not in all countries, all 4 streams or 4 tracks are there. In some countries, it might be a solution that you, let's say, develop or establish an additional vocational track. For example, if you have only a school-based track, you might think about developing a classic apprenticeship track. That might be an option, but of course, that is not an easy thing to do. We all know that. Yeah, sometimes a solution could also be that, let's say, switching from one track to another could also help students. So before dropping out, they might rather choose a vocational track. So moving from, let's say, the general stream to the vocational stream, that can also be something to fix if, for example, these transitions are not so easy in your system. Yeah, and they are still quite rigid in some countries, especially to move from the more general stream, for example, from a gymnasium, from a high school to a vocational school and vice versa.
So this is a framework called for quality and effective apprenticeships. Where does it come from? So apprenticeships has been a constant policy priority in VET at the European level from, 2010 to 2020. It's been a decade of really blossoming of apprenticeships, leading almost all EU member states to engage in actions to reform existing apprenticeship schemes or introduce new ones. And this has also led to a diversification, let's say, of policy objectives associated to this policy tool. And amid this mix of policy developments and due to concerns raised by the social partners at EU level and also by experts that not all apprenticeships ensured high quality training or even any training at all, attention turned to quality and effectiveness of this scheme. So in this context, there was a Council recommendation on the European Framework for Quality and Effective Apprenticeship, which aims to ensure that apprenticeship schemes are responsive to labor market needs and provide benefits to learners and employers alike. This is why the framework offers a well-defined set of criteria for apprenticeships to provide benefits to both employers and learners. For the purpose of the framework, apprenticeship is understood as a formal vocational education and training scheme. Maybe we can start sharing the slide, Eva, once again, that combine learning in education and training institutions with substantial work-based learning in companies and other workplaces. They lead to formally recognized qualifications, and they're based on an agreement between the employer and the apprentice. And the apprentice is paid or otherwise compensated for the work-based learning component. It is structured in 14 criteria. 7 criteria are for the learning and working conditions, which you can see in this first slide, and then you will see 7 other criteria in the second slide for the framework conditions. Let me just tell you that this is not a prescriptive list. It is not a checklist. The framework should be rather understood as a system for quality. So the criteria are interconnected. So I will not go through all of them because we don't have time, but let me just make an example. The duration of the workplace component, number 4. The quality framework says that this should be at least 50% of the duration. This should take place in the workplace. So, of course, this is meaningful if the whole duration of the program is, let's say, a few years, if it is long enough to allow the learner to develop the whole set of learning outcomes, which is criteria number 2, by the way, the whole set of comprehensive learning outcomes that are required to achieve the qualification. Of course, if we have an apprenticeship that lasts 1 month, 2 weeks of workplace component, even if it's 50%, is not does not qualify, let's say, as a quality apprenticeship, at least. Or even the first one, it's okay to have a written agreement, a written contract, but it would be important that this written agreement has a specific nature, which is the nature of an employment contract. Because these, at least in the EU member state, this is the case in most countries, or at least that the nature of this agreement is associated to the rights that ensure a fair protection of the student in the company, the social protection, the health and safety, and so forth. So you can see we have written contract, learning outcomes, pedagogical support, workplace component, remuneration, social protection, work, health, and safety condition. In the second set of criterion, so next slide, please, refers to framework conditions criteria. The first one is the presence of a consistent and clear regulatory framework. And these may include accreditation procedures, which we mentioned, for companies and workplaces that offer apprenticeships. And it should be based on an equitable partnership approach and structured and transparent dialogue between stakeholders, which is linked to the second framework criteria about the involvement of social partners. But even here, just the mere involvement of social partners may not be enough. It is important to look at which role do the social partners have in the whole process. Are they just consulted, or do they have a decision-making role? So this is why I'm telling you these criteria should be also looked at a little bit in depth to see what's behind them. It's not just a checklist, once again. Then support for companies, both financial and non-financial, particularly for micro, small, and medium-sized companies. Apprenticeship should be have the possibility to shift between pathways, so to shift to higher levels of educations that should have their learning validated if it was acquired in a non-formal or informal way, and they should have the possibility to move abroad with transnational mobility programs. All of these, of course, can be granted if the final qualification acquired through apprenticeship is included in nationally recognized qualifications framework that in the EU are referenced to the European qualifications framework. Then we have other criteria about career guidance and awareness raising, about transparency, so graduate tracking, which takes transparency, quality assurance, and graduate tracking, which takes me back to what Stefan was saying about the importance of having monitoring mechanisms in place to understand, what are the results of policy measures and what needs to be done to improve them. I will just say that last year, the International Labour Organization, the ILO, approved another recommendation, which is called Recommendation 208 on a quality apprenticeship, which of course has a broader scope of application than the European framework for quality and effective apprenticeships. Neither the recommendation of the ILO or the European recommendation have a binding nature, of course. I would say that just in word, there is a strong convergence between these two tools. And maybe I would close here, Stefan, so that you can also say something about the other framework.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. Okay, now we let's say switch from apprenticeships, so the longer programs, to the shorter traineeships. So we are typically talking about, for example, an active labor market traineeship, let's say learning in a company 3 months and learning in a vocational center also for 3 months. So let's say it's a 6 months program. And for those purposes, the European Commission also developed a separate framework already in the year 2014. It has 10 criteria. Some of them are similar to the criteria that you can find in the framework for the apprenticeships. And some are slightly different. In general, maybe the formulation is a little bit softer. But you can also see here that a couple of, let's say, elements are recommended. For example, the conclusion of a written traineeship agreement. Also, that company and learner or the vocational center that is organizing the active labor market program, that they define the learning and training objectives. The background or the reason for those first 2 or 3 criteria was clearly that there was an observation that trainees or interns were quite often exploited. So they were used as cheap labor. So that's why indeed here the Commission highlighted those criteria, that there should be a written traineeship agreement, that there should be learning and training objectives, that working conditions should be applicable to trainees, so that they should not be working, for example, late at night or at weekends, that the rights and obligations of all partners should be clearly outlined. There should be a reasonable duration. Also, that has to do with exploitation of young people. Because we saw that young people were offered one traineeship after the other. And that's why here we see, let's say, recommendation number 5 or criterion number 5 is about a reasonable duration. Proper recognition also, that is something that is lacking in many, many countries, that the traineeships or the program is not really properly recognized, is not leading to a qualification, which is in theory possible. And then, of course, there should also be transparency, especially when it comes to active labor market programs, who has access to such traineeships, and how are, for example, the candidates distributed across companies. So I invite you to have a look at those 2 frameworks, the one for apprenticeships and this one for traineeships. We are doing currently some, let's say, some analysis. We look at existing apprenticeship programs and traineeships as part of active labor market programs in our partner countries, and assess them against those criteria. And you could, of course, do the same in your countries. They are both, the frameworks are available on the internet, on the website of the European Commission, but we can, of course, also send the frameworks after this webinar. I would like to close